So I think this is something that I didn't really know until I started researching for this episode, was that Major League Baseball didn't always play 162 games. Actually, from 1904 until 1960, they played 154 games. And that's a big difference. It's 8 games a season that they played less back then. So makes some of those old-time records a little bit more impressive because, hitting 61 home runs in 8 less games is pretty meaningful.
Well, and that's how, the birth of what never really happened, but people talked about it, was the asterisk, which I think is more a term than it actually went into the record books that way. Now you'll see it when Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's home run record.
Because he did that in 61.
In 1961.
The first season where they expanded the number of games.
And Ford Frick, who was the president of the American League at the time, and a ghostwriter for Babe Ruth. And this is important, right? Because you've got Babe Ruth's record being the record from 1927.
Right.
Hitting the 60 home runs, and then Maris comes along, and Frick says, "Well, I think we should, definitely, mention something about the fact that Roger took more games to do that than Babe Ruth, and thus people turned up the asterisk." I don't think Ford Frick actually used that, himself. And for years, you look in the record books, and they actually would highlight the fact that, well, there should be almost 2 records, because Maris hit that home run in the 162nd game.
Right, but
off Tracy Stallard of the Baltimore
Orioles. Does that
Orioles.
mean that, like, somehow, because that in 1918 they only played 125 games because of the pandemic, and they played the World Series in September? So, like the fact that you didn't always play 154 games,
or 162 for that matter.
And I just think it's interesting that, one, I think obviously the idea of putting an asterisk next to those records is not fair to the players. It wasn't like they had any kind of choice or decision-making power in terms of the number of games they played. Roger Maris just showed up. They gave him 8 extra games to hit home runs, and he took full advantage of that, as he should.
Right. So this borne out. I wrote an article about this last week because it came out that when Ronald Acuna had played some unbelievable amount of games over, and I think he had played like 159 games in 185 days because he played in the World Baseball Classic, and then he played for the Braves, and then he was in the playoffs, and then this year he comes down with an ACL. And so the thought was, is it overuse? Is what the suggestion is. Did he play too much? Is it too much stress on the body?
I don't like that thinking, because it's just like, wouldn't that there be way more guys that were all having that exact? Because it's like why would it just doesn't make sense to me that, like, oh, okay, yeah, he played a bunch last season, so now this season he tears an ACL.
Because his body's still trying to recover. Well, whether that's the case or not, the question then became, well, why are we still playing 162 games? And if we had fewer games, and so, Joe Posnanski, and I like to read his stuff, he had suggested a 125-game season, which, like when I read that, I went, right, so 5 games a week, so 2 days off every week. That's like, what? That's not baseball, but, interesting idea. Over 25 weeks, the season begins in early April. It ends in late September. There's a lot of things that baseball fans would like about that. I think starting the season in late March, I don't know how baseball fans really feel about it. You're hungry for baseball.
I'm happy for baseball.
You might be okay with it.
Right.
But going into early October with the regular season and then playing World Series games into early November, maybe we could do a little better than, have the season end in November at this point. So I felt it was too far to go to 125 games.
Well, okay, I can tell you the reason why we have 162. It's the reason why all baseball fans know we have 162. It's called money. And they make more money by playing more games. So you're never going to sell the owners on the idea of going to 125 games. It's a precipitous drop-off in the number of games that they're playing, and they're never going to go for something like that. But 154 games, I think, is interesting, because it's only 8 games. It's like less than 1% games. Like, you could move on from that a little bit easier, I think. It's very interesting.
And owners are pernicious, would you say, in terms of, when the players went from 154 games to 162 games, that's like 5% more games. They did not pay the players 5% more money to play in more work days, right? No. This is your salary for the season. I don't care. Will you play the amount of games that we have on the schedule? Thank you very much. And so, and everybody thought the gates that the owners would get, right? The 8 additional dates. So let's say you get 4 home games and 4 games on the road, and the TV rights now have broadcast
That's
for
the
another
bigger
8
deal.
games. Except that, like you pointed out, the teams that would suffer the most in moving to 154 games, and that's what I'm suggesting, that's what we're suggesting, is that going back to 154 wouldn't be that dramatic. It would allow you to shorten the season a little bit so that you could have a little more air in there, and also you could maybe start the season April 1st or later and not have it go October 3rd. Let's just play the regular season between April and the end of September 30th. That's fine. You should be able to work that out, and then have your playoffs and World Series after that. It only would represent the Dodgers, the Yankees, and the Mets, obviously, and these big market teams. The total revenue loss, at least this was figured in 2018 on Fangraphs, was less than 1% of total MLB revenues.
Right, so they're not
money.
costing themselves
It's not
a ton
that much
of money
money
doing that.
And they're going to have more playoff games if they do this. You know what's going to happen, right? The Major League Baseball is looking to try to come up with, can we get a couple more teams in there? Maybe
How would we do that? What if we played 8 less
playoff games pay way more than regular season games.
What if we only played 154? Can we have a couple sudden death playoff games to determine who goes in? We're totally down with that.
So
basketball's expanded playoffs worked great for them.
And you think about how would records, right, if we went back to 154 games, and it's been that way, as you mentioned, since 1961, so over 60 years, and we had about 50, 60 years before that of 154 games. I remember that the greatest RBI seasons in Major League history were played in 154 game seasons. Right? Hack Wilson had 191 in 1930, and Lou Gehrig had 185 in 1931. So the amount of games certainly, would they have had more RBIs had they played another 8 games? I guess.
I think the thing that you have to think about is that the good thing from that perspective is that, okay, well, obviously, it's not like records that were once unbreakable, we're now, we went to 162 games. Nobody forever broke those records, so going away from 162 games isn't going to mean that, Barry Bonds' 73 home runs can never be broken. It can still be broken.
It can still be broken.
4 games.
Here's something that could happen in a 154 game season. I just thought of this as I'm sitting here talking to you. It makes hitting 400 a little easier. You just have 8 fewer games that you have to do it in. So, the longer, it's hard to hit 400, right? If you had a 200-game season, it would be harder than doing it over 162 games, and that would be more difficult than doing it over 125 or even 154 games, I would think. Just a little bit easier. It may not happen, but I think there's a little better chance, and that's kind of interesting in and of itself. But, yeah, the all-time records would take up. Could you break the all-time doubles record or triples record, season records, in 8 fewer games? Maybe you could, because those records were set before there was 162 games.
Right, exactly. So obviously, if we go away from that, they could still be set. But I do think that it is interesting because the whole idea of, these guys, they played at this different time, they played on a different schedule, is an argument that's getting kind of lumped in with other arguments, because we're seeing the same argument with bringing in the Negro League players and their records in terms of what they did over their careers, and should we put an asterisk next to them when they're put in the hall? Oh, it wasn't the same as what these other guys were doing. But it's just like, why should these different eras, either we need to completely separate the eras and say you can only be compared against guys from your time and your leagues, or we have to understand that different guys played in different eras, and obviously you can't create a perfect one-to-one comparison, but a guy that still finished his career leading the major league in average should do that whether he played 162 games in a season or 154 games.
Right, and there's a great article that SABR came out with a few years ago, and I can't remember the guy's name. I'll post it on the episode notes. The Negro Leagues was the major leagues.
It was.
Right? So that the quality of play, and you could argue that the major leagues were watered down because they didn't have Negro players playing in those in the games.
Right, exactly.
So their stats are watered down to a degree, and so the point you were making, I think, is that, those were not 162, 154 game seasons because they weren't allowed to do that.
Right, exactly. Those were external forces that were keeping them down. So if the league changed, it's not like the players are choosing. It's not like the major league was like, oh, we would like you guys to play 162 games. And the players all go, yeah, we don't feel like that. We're just going to play 154.
And most of the time when these Negro League teams were playing, and they would play in major league ballparks when the major league team wasn't there, they had so much work to do to get fans to the game that they had to promote. The players had to promote in a way that the major league didn't have to, but the Negro Leagues did. And so that the idea that the amount of games that they play because it wasn't 162 makes their records less important is not is not a good argument.
No.
It doesn't really make any sense. And these guys dominated, and they have enough stats. And we've only counted about 75% of the Negro League
We're
stats
still getting
right now.
there.
So the hardest thing is that some of the accounts, and who knows, we even know that happens in Major League games. Some of the early accounts, official scoring, I think there's, you take it with a grain of salt with some
You
of
kind
them.
of have to just trust, and you're hoping that maybe if you're lucky, you can find some other separate account to try and cross-check to verify.
Right, and the coolest thing about that, I guess, in a way, is that you can't use AI to do any of that stuff.
No.
Right, you got to have somebody go through individual ancient box scores
And
and
read
game
'em.
stuff like that and try to decipher what these people wrote, probably illegibly a lot of the time.
right.
Because if you
Try
ever
and
wrote watch my box score, you couldn't read a darn thing
And
in that
that's
thing.
a really common thing. A lot of scorers have their own little shorthand they've developed. So you probably have to get familiar with how guys from forever ago, shorthanded their baseball score
And you
books.
weren't thinking about keeping records necessarily to the degree that for posterity when you're doing
no.
games in 1927 or 1928.
Well, you're not even thinking about keeping it for stat keeping in the same way. It wasn't as important back then.
So, the games, the 154 games, has been something that even Rob Manfred has bandied about because in Major League Baseball's a desire to be international, right? And as we see, the Mets going to London again for a two-game series, it's going to take more time because if you're going to fly teams that far and have them do things away, you're going to need to put more air into the schedule.
Right, that's why the
154 games makes it a little easier to do
the
that.
Mets have 2 days off on either side of the London.
2 days off before and 1 day off after.
Right. That's a lot of
So
time.
2 games in 5 days. It's almost like an all-star break.
Right, that's a long time off for them.
So and they want to go beyond playing games in London. Could you imagine a Europe division of the major leagues?
I'm sure Major League Baseball is.
Right. Is there enough interest over there? I don't know.
And you know that if they're willing to do Europe, then they have to be thinking about a Asia Pacific division. They would love to get that over there somehow.
But I don't think. Look, we watch a lot of baseball, right? I don't think missing 8 games, if there were 8 fewer baseball games, and by the way, if the Mets want to this year play 154 games instead of 162, right now, I don't know that any Met fan is going to argue with you on this.
And I think I would also be way more willing to play like 150. I'd be way more willing to play less. Like, I'd be way down to play 125 games if it meant we got more international competition for baseball.
Well, that's interesting.
If we played 125 games, but that means we could do the World Baseball Classic every year. Or you were able to do different, like the way that golf has the Ryder Cup and the President's Cup. What if we had more stuff like that for baseball that you would be able to do? You could have East versus West, or America versus Cuba, like the Cuba and Puerto Rico or something.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think if you think about the Japanese leagues and the Korean leagues, I think their level of play is much closer to Major League Baseball than it's ever been. Maybe it isn't exactly there, but it's pretty.
And doing more regional leagues and regional tournaments, because obviously doing the World Baseball Classic every year would potentially dilute the overall quality of the it would make it not as special. But if you had a smaller regional tournament, you might be able to get some countries involved that wouldn't be able to compete on necessarily a World Baseball Classic stage, but they could compete on a smaller, more regional stage, and you could invite them in.
Well, and you think about the statistics that are in the World Baseball Classic, and we know the teams are trying there, but those statistics do not count towards a player's major league totals. And that seems, when you think about it, is that maybe something that could change also?
I think it could. I think especially if you went and you played 125 games because you were trying to increase, more out of, Major League Baseball season game stuff, then yeah, but I don't think we'll ever get to doing that because there's no way the owners will ever go for playing 125 games.
I don't think so either, but I'm glad you said that because it's an interesting thing to postulate about. You think about these statistics in the Japan and the KBO and the Nippon leagues. Should their statistics be included now? We just included the Major League, the Negro League statistics into the Major League. Why?
Because they're their own league, they have their own Hall of Fame. And so I think by putting them into Major League Baseball, you do this weird thing where you say, oh, you guys were actually Major League Baseball players all along. And they weren't because they were never part of that. So I think having them be separate is important because they should be celebrated as their own achievements. And I don't want to see some of those guys get. You're going to get guys.
Wouldn't Ichiro be the all-time hit king if you included it?
Right. And I think that now as you're going to see that, but that's why you're going to see guys like Ohtani and the guys that can compete and ready to come over. They're going to come over earlier and earlier because they're going to be able to leave their legacy in Major League Baseball and say, no, I was one of the greatest players in this league. You can't take that away from me.
But it doesn't allow you to see, and it's hard to see 20, 30 years into the future that you could have an Asian division of Major League Baseball.
Oh, it could be coming.
You could have a few teams in Europe and play, you could play it's just trying to move the teams around to play that is a very difficult thing, which is why one of the reasons why we're talking about the length of a season, whether 154 games is right. I think we all think that we could have fewer games. What are you going to do with it?
Right. I think that's the tricky part is where do you actually spend this time on and with? Because, and part of the reason we are also talking about going to a 154 game season is that we do think that the workload and the amount of players are being expected, all these teams shifting to a six-man rotation for their pitchers, kind of speaks to the fact that, okay, obviously they can't keep up with what the current load is. Giving them 8 extra off days across the season could be a pretty big deal in terms of how rested these teams are.
Well, and the Japanese league, I'm pretty sure they basically pitch on a 6-man rotation, right?
Right.
And they have 1 day off a week. And I think that's the way that it works in the MPB. And so they don't appear to have as many pitcher injuries. Now, they pitch differently tactically than they do here in the U.S. A lot more curveballs and a lot more, different style. But it is interesting to me that the Japanese pitchers don't come up quite as injured.
They don't play nearly as many games.
They don't play nearly. I think they play something close to like 140 games or something like that.
And that might have a big impact on why you're seeing.
Because it's not like those guys don't trade hard or are not working hard.
Right,
so
they're trying just as hard.
They try, if not harder sometimes,
Right.
if you read some of the accounts of what's like to play Japanese baseball, Kareem. So, I think Major League Baseball is on with this, maybe not for the reasons that we're talking about, but I could see them having fewer games, whatever the number may be. And unfortunately, it's probably going to end up being more playoff games than anything else. And if we get some international games in there.
Well, that would at least kind of help, spread it out throughout the year. Because then, we're sitting here right now talking about lowering the number of games in baseball. Like we're not sitting here in January going, "I wish there was baseball."
Definitely.